Questions of Doom.
Hello and welcome back to another Questions of Doom. In this series, as ever, I attempt to answer questions that you send my way using the archaeosoup@gmail.com email address, as displayed on the YouTube channel homepage, but as you'll also see at the end of this video. In answering these questions by video, it is my fond hope that the answer is not only useful to the person who has asked the question, but also anyone else out there who may be wondering the same thing. Now, this is the first question of Doom of 2014, and it has to do with evolution, the nature of evolution. It's quite an interesting one, actually. Dear Mr. Soup, is evolution always a matter of life and death? My understanding is that depending on how well adapted a particular species is, it will either live or die in its environment as it changes. That is to say, as the environment changes, I presume. Darwin's finches died off according to their adaptation or lack thereof, leaving certain shaped beaks behind on particular islands in the Galapagos. So surely we're doing pretty well. We're well adapted because we're alive. Life is good, ? Or rather, life is good? Is this true? Thanks, Mitch. Well, Mitch, you ask a very interesting question. You also make certain assumptions about the nature of evolution and also actually its implications for living species. That is to say, whether or not evolution means that right now my ability to sit here in front of this camera, use the internet, use language, answer your question, your ability to ask questions, means something in terms of evolutionary success, but I'll come back to that. I suppose the answer is yes and no. Evolution is both a matter of life and death, and also a matter distinctly of not life or death. Actually, it's also about, I suppose more specifically, your ability to pass on your genes to the next generation. It's not quite so active as you might think. It's a little bit more passive, a little bit more elegant, I suppose, rather than simply being an arbitrary you are not a successful species, you must die. It's a little bit more elegant, passive, a little bit more nuanced than that. So first of all, it's worthwhile considering different types of selection and different types of pressure, I suppose, on species, and therefore shaping, I suppose, what they become and how they become that, how people became people, for example. So first of all, yes, environmental pressures. You're quite right. There will be situations where environmental pressures have dramatic effects on populations, on species, on animals, birds, fish, etc. But these are very few and far between. An environmental pressure is much more likely to change one's ability to be really competitive in that environment, rather than it is to kill off your species. So, for example, a change in rainfall may well affect how much vegetation is growing, or certain types of plant may be very sensitive to that. This may well affect the very specific animal which feeds on that very specific plant, and therefore affect the very specific predator which feeds on that particular animal. But this won't immediately kill them off. What it will do is it will alter, for example, the plant will be less successful because it's not as healthy as it was. It's not passing on its genes to the next generation. The animal that eats the plant will find fewer plants around, and therefore will not be as healthy, not be as shiny, glossy coated or whatever. Therefore, may not be as successful in passing on its genes for a couple of reasons, but we'll come to those in a moment. And therefore, if there are possibly fewer of those creatures around, that will have an effect on the predator of those creatures. But it's not about actively killing them. It's about success. It's about, I suppose, the resultant numbers in the next generation following on from the current generation's actions. An element of this is tied in with the selective part of it. That is to say, both active and, again, passive selective pressures. So one of them would be, for example, rearing or breeding selections and strategies. K-type selective or breeding strategies are the ones which people employ, which humans employ. That is to say, we have very few, usually, offspring, and we put a lot of parental time and effort into that offspring to ensure that they survive into the next generation, and that they hopefully will pass on their genes to their children, so on and so forth. R-type, that is to say R, the letter R, not our type, R-type selection is where a creature will have loads and loads and loads of offspring, put very little parental time and effort into those offspring, in the hope that even if a percentage of that offspring gets killed off, the rest will survive. A good example of R-type selection is, turtles, yes. Turtles who will come to particular beaches, lay their eggs, bury them in the sand, and eventually the babies will hatch, they'll come out, they'll try and make it to the sea, but often they're very highly predated at the point of birth. In other words, there'll be creatures waiting for them to hatch, or indeed who will be smashing open the eggs before they've even hatched. And the strategy there is to have as many eggs as possible so that some will survive, but there's very little parenting that goes into that. So that's a type of selection which I suppose actually you could say is very much about life and death, but also it doesn't actively kill off the creature. It's all about the way in which you try to ensure that those genes are passed on to the next generation. It's not actively deciding life and death over those creatures. It's all about investing in their potential, in the future, as it were. Kin selection and societal selection. These rules, especially in social animals, such as, for example, human beings, will dramatically affect one's ability to pass on one's genes. If a group decides to throw their lot in with a politically unfashionable group, then they're taking a big risk in terms of their ability to pass on their genes. They may well find themselves shunned by their peers. But the same goes the other way around. If you throw your lot in with a bunch of people who are actually very attractive, very wealthy, very sexy, then you may well find that your chances actually rise of having, for example, children, essentially. But more subtly than that as well, it's about who you decide to hold close to, who you will, for example, give your life for. You wouldn't necessarily, in a tornado or in a horrible momentary life and death decision, you wouldn't necessarily give your life for, I don't know, Mrs. Jones who lives 3 streets away, but you would give your life for your brother. And these decisions, again, it is life and death on the one hand. It does affect who lives and who dies to a certain extent, but it's actually more about, again, preserving your ability, or preserving people around you and their ability to pass on their genes. A broader example of this would be societal, I suppose, a societal level kin selection, where, I don't know, a very mild version of this might be, a very extreme example would be the X-Men. Actually, the X-Men from the Marvel comics. They've been singled out as being, depending on which strand of the comics you're reading, as being weird, as being probably a new species. And this means that actually many normal human beings find it really difficult to be in a relationship with them, both because of peer pressure from their family, for example, but also actually because they're not quite sure what this means, what this new group of people are. Also, that new group of people, these X-Men, they find themselves drawn to each other. Often you'll get them partnering up and having children themselves, which means that actually this selection, this societal pressure, starts to actually separate out those two groups even more, essentially segregating them and their genetic pools. So that the X-Men are more likely to have more X-children, and the normal people are more likely to have normal children, because they're not actually mingling, they're not actually interbreeding, interconnecting, as even though they had been the same species, as it were. And again, it's not really about life and death. It's not killing or actively shortening the lives of the people who are involved, or the creatures who are involved. It's all about where, how, why, and when they pass on their genes, and whether or not they can pass on their genes to the next generation. Another example, I suppose, of another variant on this, the idea, for example, of mutation, is variation within a population. Yes, evolution will favour certain features in certain species, but also evolution favours variation. The reason why, or the potential for variation rather, the reason why Darwin's Darwin's finches were able to adapt to different islands in different ways, growing their beaks larger or more pointy or whatever over time in order to adapt to certain food types, is because within that population, who probably left Chile, within that population there was the variation, the genetic variation in the background, not just what's on the surface, the phenotype, but in the genotype, recessive genes, so on and so forth. There was the possibility that through environmental pressures, the birds could change and adapt. And that's worthwhile considering as well. It's not always a literal, you have a big beak, therefore you will live. It's also about the whole population, and whether or not, when the environment does start to shift, and I suppose as you hinted in your question, when the environment does change, whether or not those birds have the ability within their genes, within their recessive and within their genotype, to actually produce offspring who can be viable in that new environment. Now, all of these different pressures and ideas and selective strategies do affect each other in a myriad of different ways. So a slightly silly example would be if I was to develop a jelly head, or rather if my species was to develop a jelly head, one of my offspring or something, that may well mean that actually that person, I am very, very lucky, because if I fall off a roof, for example, I'm less likely to crack my skull open on the pavement below, because the jelly will preserve my head. Preserve jelly, no, but it will possibly defend my head against the impact of the pavement. But it will probably have an effect on my ability to pass on my genes. There'll be certain people, certain very attractive or very desirable partners who won't necessarily want to breed with someone who's got a jelly head. So the jelly head, while a very positive mutation, a very positive adaptation, and certainly not one that's actually resulted in my death. In fact, actually, it's preserving my life when I fall off roofs or whatever. It has affected the sexual selection element. It's affected my attractiveness to potential partners. So again, it's one of those things where the matter is very complicated, and all these things aren't necessarily just about life and death. It's about potential. It's about legacy, and it's about essentially the future, I suppose. So typically the process of selection doesn't actively kill you or kill off a species. What it does is it just doesn't allow that species or those particular adaptations to continue. It doesn't allow them, it doesn't make them competitive enough to actually pass on into the next generation. So this is really, I suppose, the focus of and this is also the reason why it's such a beautiful theory, is that actually it's always about what happens next. It's not really necessarily about what's happening right now. To a certain extent, this generation is fixed. I can't just out of nowhere evolve a jelly head. But the fact that I may well have a child, me and Mrs. Soup, for example, may well have a child, means that we will be putting our chips in the next generation. Our bet, as it were, will be in the next round of humanity, and therefore we'll be in that race. The ability to evolve a jelly head is still in there somewhere and may well happen. But this shouldn't really affect, and hopefully it doesn't really affect, your view of life now, though. Life now is wonderful. I mean, you say in your question, life is good. Life is good? Life is good. The ability, I suppose the unrivaled privilege of being a conscious human being is excellent. You know, the ability to appreciate music, art, language, the ability to feel pain, even the ability to ask questions, the ability to answer questions, is a real privilege. And while this doesn't have a direct bearing on the evolution of my species, this moment, as it were, I've received my genetic material, and hopefully I may well pass it on in the not too distant future. The life that I am living shouldn't really be affected by the thoughts of evolutionary viability. Life has to be about more than that as well. So don't let it get you down that you may well have a brilliant adaptation which actually isn't passed on because of other factors, and it's nothing to do with whether or not you're alive or dead. Don't let that get you down. Life is wonderful, so definitely hold on to that. But also don't try to think about evolution in a slightly different way. It's not that, as I say, that selective pressures actively kill you or will actively result in your termination, but they will. And they do, and they are affecting our ability to pass on our genes to the next generation. And even if you are Superman, so you may well struggle to find a partner, and therefore you may well not pass on your genes to that next generation. And that's really what evolution's about. It's that one step in the future. And that's something which I find really, really quite beautiful, actually, and quite exciting about Darwin's excellent theory. So hopefully this has gone some way to answering your question, sort of to tackling those thoughts, I suppose. I know I've rambled on a little bit, but hopefully this has been a useful discussion. Please do comment below if you have any thoughts or feelings on the matter. Do keep the comments civilized, as always. And both I, actually, and Mitch, I'm sure, would love to read what you have to say below. If you have any questions for me, please do send them in, as always, to archaeosoup@gmail.com. And, well, I suppose until next time, do take care. Bye-bye.